Welcome to our invited symposium, Paranoia, Narcissism, and Otherness, a round robin. My name is Lauren Kaminsky. I teach at Harvard. I'm also the Director of Studies in History and Literature at Harvard. Here's how this is going to go. So each of our distinguished panelists are going to have 3 5-minute presentations in this order. And so I will introduce them in order now. So nearest to me is Anne Pellegrini, Professor of Performance Studies and Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. Her books include Performance Anxieties, Staging Psychoanalysis, Staging Race and Love with Sin, Sexual Regulation and the Limits of Religious Tolerance, co-authored with Janet Jacobson. She enjoys psychoanalysis and show tunes, and is a candidate in adult psychoanalysis at IPTAR in New York City. Next is Linda Schlossberg. Linda received her PhD in English and American Literature from Harvard and now serves as Assistant Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. She is the author of the novel Life in Miniature and the co-editor of Passing, Identity and Interpretation of Sexuality, Race, and Religion from NYU Press. Next is Carolyn Stack, who's a psychoanalyst in private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is on the faculty at Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis, and she is the co-editor of Bringing the Plague Toward a Postmodern Psychoanalysis. And finally, Barbara Browning teaches in the Department of Performance Studies at NYU. She writes cultural analysis in the forms of fiction, nonfiction, and, most typically, something in between. Her most recent novel is The Gift. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Anne Pellegrini.
In her now classic 1981 essay, Uses of Anger, Black lesbian feminist poet and essayist Audre Lorde calls out guilt, and she is specifically writing about white feminist guilt. She calls it out as, in her words, a device to protect ignorance and the continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness, close quote. This is guilt as a deflection of the other's experience and one's implication in it. She goes on to dare women of color to upset the feminist fantasy of unity without difference or differences of opinion, urging women of color to name and speak their anger aloud, and challenging white feminists to hear it without getting defensive. Here's more from Lorde. The angers between women will not kill us if we can articulate them with precision, if we listen to the content of what is said with at least as much intensity as we defend ourselves against the manner of saying. When we turn from anger, we turn from insight, saying we will accept only the designs already known, deadly and safely familiar. So, instead of turning from anger, we need to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it. Meeting Lorde's charge to tarry with anger remains no less urgent and no less comforting today than it was when she issued her call in 1981. Now, I first typed those words the day before the presidential election of 2016. I return to them now, some 9 months into the presidency of Donald Trump, words I thought I would never have to write. My assertion for the value of anger and the need for still more of it may seem counterproductive at a time when polarization and the outright demonization of those with whom one disagrees has become the defining feature and feeling tone of US politics, let alone our tweeter-in-chiefs. Commentators bemoan the erosion of political civility, a trend supposedly brought to negative apogee, that is the highest point of decline, by President Donald Trump. And yet, what if lamentations over the shattering of shared norms of civility and calls for its return are a different version of making America great again? To be sure, calls for civility often function as a rhetorical maneuver to silence those with whom the speaker disagrees. And if that does not succeed, at least to morally aggrandize one's own position as the very measure of reason, a reasonable compromise, as against one's intractable opponents. I'm civil, you aren't, I win. Now, I'm far less interested in these canny and self-conscious deployments of calls for civility than I am in their psychic underbelly. What can the disavowed or tranquilized viscera of negative feelings tell us about democracy and its discontents? What if we stay with anger and bad feelings? In listening for the viscera, to the viscera, I mean to keep faith with Lord's call to learn within anger. But we have to proceed cautiously here. There are uses of anger, and there are, well, uses of anger. They're not all equivalent. Lord is helpful on this point. She doesn't think that all forms of anger are equally usable or equally possible. In her essay, she's explicitly discussing anger between peers. Peers have common goals, she says, but they may be blocked from realizing these shared goals, and even from recognizing each other across the gulf of self and other on account of distortions of history. That's her term, distortions of history. Importantly, the kind of peer-to-peer contact across differences that Lord describes is precisely not a case of individuals or groups comfortably sticking with one's own, so as to zero out exposure to others' opinions and experiences. This peer-to-peer contact, that is, has within it already difference. In contrast, where there are deeply entrenched and activated asymmetries of power, all too often the furious hatred of the dominant can be enacted, sometimes with deadly force, against those with less power. In drawing these distinctions, and that's not a good situation for a kind of fair expression of anger. In drawing these distinctions, Lord is thus pointing to the material contexts and powerful histories that render anger usable or not, and contact with anger survivable or deadly. Here, it may be worth noting that the word contact comes from con, the Latin for together with, and tangere, the Latin for to touch.
All right, always difficult to have to follow Audre Lorde, not to mention Anne Pellegrini. So I'll be reading, obviously, 3 different pieces, and this first one is nonfiction, and it is called George, Martha, Mom, and Me, What Edward Albee Taught Me About My Mother's Mental Illness. Why is your nose so red? My mother would ask me every day when I came home from school. It was 1982, and she was convinced I was snorting coke. At 12 years old, I was nerdy and introverted, buried in books. All I knew of cocaine was the Eric Clapton song and vague references to Studio 54. But my mother, already mentally unstable and given to paranoia, saw drugs everywhere. In another time and place, she might have been convinced that her salt shaker was bugged, or that the commies were out to recruit her, or that aliens were going to summon her to their spaceship. But this was the era of Nancy Reagan, and the war on drugs was ascendant. My mother was surrounded by sensationalist news reports of playground pushers seeking to get grade school kids like me hooked on drugs. There were apparently people everywhere, perfectly normal-looking people, forcing children to shoot up behind the 7-Eleven, sneaking acid into lick-em sticks and sweet tarts. My mother found these stories strangely comforting, a way to make sense of the confusion and fear that disordered her world. Rifling through the kitchen drawer for quarters to play video games, I would find mimeographed pamphlets about teens and drugs, doodled over with my mother's shopping lists. My mother would pepper me with questions about my bloodshot eyes, examine my arms for track marks, search through my closet for drug paraphernalia. As her fears grew deeper, her behavior grew more erratic, pulling me out of school early, tracking me in her navy blue Buick Skylark whenever I left the house, eventually moving us from one apartment to another, convinced that the shadowy dealers of her imagination were going to find us and force me into a life of addiction. Sometime around this age, I stumbled upon a paperback edition of Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. To say that Albee fell outside of my usual reading interests, which still at that point ran to horse stories and Agatha Christie's, would be an understatement. But the play, animated by a deep irony far beyond my 6th grade emotional vocabulary, obsessed me. The story of George and Martha, who trick their guests, but more significantly themselves, into believing they have a child, spoke to me deeply. Its themes of motherhood and marriage were foreign to me, not even far in the future possibilities. But the idea of a delusional belief system strong enough to shape one's daily reality was all too familiar. I read it over and over, trying to grasp at a meaning I did not yet understand. Albee's genius was that he made George and Martha's craziness the basis of their love. Their games of let's pretend maintain rather than threaten their relationship. The play hinges on George and Martha's deep and abiding love for their imaginary child, a son they play act into being. At some level, I understood that my mother's delusional system forged a powerful bond between us. Her fantasies of just around the corner danger and near escapes resulted in inadvertent fun, especially for a kid with few school friends. Immobile with fear, she would insist on keeping me home from school, but then, suddenly feeling better, she'd drive us somewhere smack in the middle of the day. The local bowling alley, the ice skating rink, even the racetrack, where she'd let me place small bets on horses with funny names like Shaky Lady and American Dream. We were basically playing hooky from our real life, our own version of fun and games, making up the day as we went along. And I often won those bets. No wonder I pored over that paperback copy of Albie's play. It was perfect for a child whose daily schedule was built around the tension between reality and delusion, belief and despair. But the play wasn't just sad, it was sweet. After all, George and Martha really did love that child. My mother's illness grew steadily worse. I grew up, drew deeper into the world of books, and became a literature professor. Occasionally, I would teach Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, scanning my students' faces for moments of recognition. Only years later did I realize that that copy of the play must have been my mother's.
Fiction, maybe. The Night Has 1,000 Eyes, Bobby V. crooned way back when, warning his girl that he was watching her run around ways. 1,000 eyes can't help but see if you were true to me. Let's say that he of 1,000 eyes, not Bobby V, not necessarily even a man, but paranoia itself has all of those eyes, each one beady, keen, casting this way and that, picking up cues to create a story of treachery that's a foregone conclusion, a story already written, but one in need of color, shapes, sounds, and smells, to turn it into absolute truth. Paranoia, begins to suspect the loved one of cheating, and the many-eyed gaze descends upon the once beloved, lifting covers, slipping around corners, catching glimmers of never-before noticed clues. The other, the lover, feels the pinprick of paranoia, mistakes it for a gnat, swats at it, but too late. The poison of it has already pierced a patch of pale skin on the forearm, and a round of redness flushes the site of invasion. This prick, this painful itch, alerts the other and she draws inward. One might say that paranoia has infected her as well, for now she's watchful of him. She sees his shadow, she thinks, pass under the doorframe when she's on the phone. She notices him watching her, not with the fondness or the razor-sharp edge of desire once familiar, but instead with a glint of dark yellow from his narrowed scrutiny. She shrinks, almost imperceptibly. But paranoia's eyes catch that slight withering and reads it, not as a response to his humble gaze, because of course paranoia does not look inward, cannot see what she might see, but views it instead as a signal of guilt, treachery. Our character, paranoia, now believes his beloved is gone. He hacks into her email. He grabs her phone when the familiar light of a text shimmers across the darkened screen. He sniffs her neck for the taste of another when he kisses her. He finds, of course, what he suspects in an email exchange with a supposed friend, except he's never heard of that bitch before, that so-called friend. It's some unknown idiot writing in code, a few lines of poetry. Now he knows that he's been betrayed, cuckolded, and a flush of rage surges in his blood. No matter that the girlfriend has said her reading group is focusing on contemporary poets, paranoia warps the tale of the reading group into just that, a tale made up to hide illicit romance. Paranoia misreads, reads its worst fears into a narrative. Paranoia projects badness onto the other. It cleanses the self by imbuing the other with all that is hated in itself, and all that hated stuff of nightmare returns in the form of persecuting forces. Everyone is against him. They are all losers. Our fictional fellow, birthed by the coupling of the Greek para, meaning beside or contrary, and noia, from mind or thought, is now beside himself. In his contrary mind, the other, the once beloved, is no longer separate, distinct, a person in their own right, lovable because of and despite difference. The quirky things he once loved about her, he now despises. Where he once saw her fondness for corny movies, say, as a sign of her tender heart, imagining himself as the beneficiary, he now ridicules her as ditzy, mindless. Mindless, yes, for he has evacuated his own mindlessness, his own beside thought into her, despising her, really himself, for tenderness, need, longing for succor. She has betrayed him, he believes, but really he has betrayed himself for daring to risk love, need, dependence. And he must kill that desire now in her body before it kills him. Whether a fictional character literally kills or doesn't, no matter. For this is a story of how the demon Paranoia works on us and through us, destroying our capacities to love and be loved.
Thank you. I decided to read 3 short excerpts from fictional or semi-fictional narratives, each one reflecting the personal paranoia of the narrator in relation to general social and political anxiety. So the first passage is from a novel I wrote called I'm Trying to Reach You. I'm wearing a costume, by the way. I'll take this off in a second. It's a novel that opens in the summer of 2009 when 3 iconic dance figures died in rapid succession. You may remember Michael Jackson, Pina Bausch, Merce Cunningham. The paranoid narrator, Gray Adams, constructs a conspiracy theory based on some video clues posted to YouTube, but also clearly fueled by the racist, sexist, and homophobic comments on those posts. My narrators and my own unease at the time stemmed from a premonition that some of that virulence was manifesting a backlash to our nation's first black president, and I say now, not without sorrow, that subsequent events appear to have borne out this situation. The following passage recounts an academic paper delivered by the narrator regarding 2 choreographic performances that he and I attended that year, both of which featured performers in trench coats, only feeding his and my sense of a world gone noir, and not in the good sense of the term. I cleared my throat and said, actually, I have a new title for this talk. It's called Stalkers, Spies, and Flashers. I thought I sensed a pricking up of certain ears in the room. Adams goes on to describe the first performance, which involved a flash mob-style parade of discreetly disguised, trench-coated cell phone users. He cites the cultural critic Lauren Berlant on the politics of lurking in the public sphere. Lurking, Berlant tells us, means our communications are increasingly constituted by what we overhear. Ambient sound, she says, engenders ambient citizenship. My narrator goes on to describe a second choreography in which similarly trench-coated, drone-ish dancers pirouetted along streets on the Lower East Side, this time evidently celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He says, I tried vaguely to parse out the differences between the ambiguous anti-commercialism of the pseudo-flash mob and the equally confusing anti-communism of pirouetting, self-disrobing secret police. And then I considered the trench coat. I said, there are 3 reasons to wear a trench coat. Because you have something to find, something to hide, or something you want desperately to show. The garment that seems to beg you, don't notice me, is also begging you to take notice, whether the wearer wants you to see what's underneath, or whether he wants you simply to fear it. But part of the contract is for the wearer and the witness, who's also being watched, to maintain the fiction of the non-theatricality, of the non-spectacularity, of the extreme understatement of the performance. Here, the narrator's mind shoots to the noirish villain of his conspiracy theory in all his beige minimalism. I concluded somewhat lyrically, we increasingly move through a soundscape both overheard and understated. It emanates from the earbuds of the iPods and cell phones of our fellow passengers, who may or may not be fellow travelers. Or perhaps they're indicating to us what it means now, maybe always meant, to be a fellow traveler, an unacknowledged intimate in a political sphere
that attempts to cover itself in discretion, even as it exposes itself. There was a beat. Then Fang, unable to contain herself, said, "This is, after all, how ideology works." I stared back at her. There was an awkward pause, and then I looked up and said, "That's it." Jose Munoz stood and faced the audience and said, "Great. I think we have maybe time for one question or so. Any questions, comments?" Another brief, awkward pause. And then Dan Ferguson just tossed out a fake, jokey, pseudo question to give us an excuse to break. "Okay then, Gray, what about you? Do you have something to find, something to hide, or something you want desperately to show?" Everyone laughed nervously, and I said, "I'm not sure."
James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. That sinners have always, for American Negroes, been white is a truth we needn't labor. And every American Negro, therefore, risks having the gates of paranoia close on him. In a society that is entirely hostile and by its nature seems determined to cut you down, that has cut down so many in the past and cuts down so many every day, it begins to be almost impossible to distinguish a real from a fancied injury. One can very quickly cease to attempt this distinction, and what is worse, one usually ceases to attempt it without realizing that one has done so. All doormen, for example, and all policemen have by now, for me, become exactly the same. And my style with them is designed simply to intimidate them before they can intimidate me. No doubt I am guilty of some injustice here, but it is irreducible, since I cannot risk assuming that the humanity of these people is more real to them than their uniforms. Most Negroes cannot risk assuming that the humanity of white people is more real to them than their color. And this leads imperceptibly, but inevitably, to a state of mind in which, having long ago learned to expect the worst, one finds it very easy to believe the worst. The brutality with which Negroes are treated in this country simply cannot be overstated, however unwilling white men may be to hear it. In the beginning, and neither can this be overstated, a Negro just cannot believe that white people are treating him as they do. He does not know what he has done to merit it, and when he realizes that the treatment accorded him has nothing to do with anything he has done, that the attempt of white people to destroy him, for that is what it is utterly gratuitous, it is not hard for him to think of white people as devils. For the horrors of the American Negro's life, there has been almost no language. The privacy of his experience, which is only beginning to be recognized in language, and which is denied or ignored in official and popular speech, hence the Negro idiom, lends credibility to any system that pretends to clarify it. And in fact, the truth about the black man, as an historical entity and as a human being, has been hidden from him, deliberately and cruelly. The power of the white world is threatened whenever a black man refuses to accept the white world's definitions. So every attempt is made to cut that black man down. Not only was made yesterday, but is made today. Who then is to say with authority where the root of so much anguish and evil lies? Why then is it not possible that all things began with the black man and that he was perfect? Especially since this is precisely the claim that white people have put forward for themselves all these years. Furthermore, it is now absolutely clear that white people are a minority in the world, so severe a minority that they now look rather more like an invention, and that they cannot possibly hope to rule it any longer. If this is so, why is it not also possible that they achieve their original dominance by stealth and cunning and bloodshed and in opposition to the will of heaven, and not as they claim by heaven's will? And if this is so, then the sword they've used so long against others can now, without mercy, be used against them. Heavenly witnesses are a tricky lot, to be used by whoever is closest to heaven at the time. And legend and theology, which are designed to sanctify our fears, crimes, and aspirations, also reveal them for what they are. Hence the question, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house?
Okay, so this next piece that I'm reading was inspired by something that Oklahoma Representative Justin Humphreys said, if you recall, last February when speaking about pregnant women and reproductive rights, where you might have mentioned that he referred to pregnant women not as American citizens or as individuals or as people or any such thing, but rather as hosts who were hosting fetuses for the duration of their pregnancy. And so the full quote from him is this: I understand that women feel it's their body. I feel like it's a separate, what I call them is you're a host. And you know when you enter into a sexual relationship, you're going to be that host. And so, you know, if you pre-know that, then take all the precautions and don't get pregnant. Okay, so that's the exact quote from Justin Humphreys. So inspired by that, I wrote this piece, which was published in McSweeney's, and it is called Enjoy Your Stay, a host's welcome message to her fetal guest. And this may be a paranoid piece of fiction. But hi and welcome. My name's Rachel, and I'll be your host for the next 9 months. I hope you'll enjoy the space. I know it's a little snug, but I think you'll find it has everything you need. About me, I'm originally from the Midwest, but I moved out here for school and couldn't love it more. I'm a real outdoors girl at heart. Nothing makes me happier than surfing at one of our beautiful beaches or hiking in the mountains. Of course, I won't be doing any of those things while you're here. You're the first guest I've had, so I'm a little nervous. The truth is, I didn't think I'd start hosting so soon. I sort of wanted to wait till I finished college and started my career and had a real job and some money. But my husband's really into it, so what the heck, let's do this. Here's a secret. We just got married when we found you were showing up. My boyfriend, oh, he's my husband, I keep forgetting, has promised me a real wedding later. We'll see how that goes. Look, I feel a little bad I didn't have more time to prepare for your arrival, but I've been working overtime to get everything in tip-top shape. Normally on the weekends, I kind of like to party, but while you're here, I'm going to make sure to keep the space clear of drugs and alcohol. I think you'll like what I've done. I always say one of the nice things about having a guest is it forces you to clean up. While I was cleaning up, I decided just to throw out all my meds. It's really not that big a deal. My husband says a lot of what we call anxiety is just in your head and a product of living in this crazy 24/7 always-on world. I've already downloaded a bunch of relaxation apps, and I think we're going to see some big changes around here. Listen, I'm sure it goes without saying that there's no smoking. Okay. Speaking of which, you might have heard that the air quality around here isn't the greatest. Smog, all that. It's not such a huge deal, but maybe we'll just stay inside on those days. You already know that I'll be providing all your meals, and I want to assure you that everything will be organic. Normally I just eat whatever, but it's different when you have a guest. It's pretty expensive, but that's what credit cards are for. Seriously, you deserve it. Did I mention there's a weekly farmer's market just down the street? Just another thing about this area I really love. Hey, do you like classical music? I don't really, but it sounds like most hosts play it for their guests. So maybe I'll just use your visit as an excuse to learn something new. Expand my horizons, as my boyfriend always says. Oh, I mean husband. I guess that's about it. Since we're in such close quarters, I'll be sure to keep still and not make a lot of noise so you can get all the rest you need. I have a feeling you'll sleep like a baby. Just kick on the wall if you need anything.
Eerie, maybe. Narcissistic love gazes into the pool of the other's eyes and sees great beauty, perfection itself. Smitten by this vision of an exquisite angel of otherness gazing back, adoring, cherishing, narcissism is blinded to the truth that what is seen is a mere mirage, a phantasmatic creation born of yearning for all that has not happened and never will. Where narcissism thinks there is two, there is not even one. Its idealized self displaced onto the other, it sees only its reflection in a pool of mercurial pleasure, a shimmering gaze of adoration in endless repetition. Psychoanalysis imagines a necessary state of illusory love. There is no such thing as a baby, only a mother-infant, Winnicott famously says, imagining the new mom falling into a kind of fugue state in the first few weeks of the neonate life. Almost an illness, he says, of the state of primary maternal preoccupation. Here, in the beginning, for this is an origin myth, mother and baby are one. In the safety of illusory oneness, the infant begins to sense something akin to being the owner of his or her bodily sensations. Now, the emerging infant can experience unavoidable threats of annihilation and, importantly, recover from them. Mother, too, recovers from her almost illness, becoming a self again, repressing all memory of this experience as it sinks back into the primordial ooze. One becomes two. Whether true or not for infant and mother, no matter, for my purpose here is to highlight the mythology of idealized love in psychological, social, mystical, and political narratives that suggest the possibility of transcendence beyond suffering, of perfection itself. Think romantic love, think the 1950s family fantasy, utopian communities, and the fantasy of autocratic nations. For Winnicott, the recognition of absolute dependence on the mother and of her capacity for primary maternal preoccupation belongs to and I quote, belongs to a stage of extreme sophistication not always reached by adults, unquote. Note that it's not the state itself or the capacity to be in it, but the recognition of this state that he sees as the pinnacle of psychological achievement. It's the capacity to hold dependence in mind, and I would say to bear the knowledge of dependence, of the need and yearning, for it is that allows us the freedom to understand me and not me, to be interdependent, to play, to think alone and with others, and to be in relation. There is, of course, a necessary self-love and an essential wariness, but at the extremes of paranoia and narcissism, where the knowledge of dependence and self and other cannot be borne, where threats to annihilation cannot be successfully negotiated, the slightest injury is untenable. Narcissism and paranoia, then, are two sides of the same coin. Each protects against injury when an injury is experienced as annihilation. Narcissism can only be incredible, amazing, the biggest, the winners, can only surround itself with others imagined as great and as adoring. When that bubble is all too easily popped, paranoia sees only losers, morons, the weak and the crooked, but in the other, of course, not in self.
The second passage I'm going to read is from this novel, The Gift, which traces the increasing anxiety of the narrator, Barbara Anderson, as she attempts to build an artistic collaboration and gift economy with someone who may or may not be who he says he is. Again, their exchanges take place on the internet and are shadowed by the crumbling of the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and some other glimmers of hope that seem to be flickering out in 2011. This passage cuts in shortly after the narrator travels to Germany to meet her collaborator, only to discover that he doesn't live at the address he's told her. In fact, he fails to materialize at all. She'd previously tried to send him a tiny flask of perfume called Realism to his house, and it never got to him, which perhaps should have tipped her off. This all really happened. You laugh, but it really happened. She thought it was because the U.S. Postal Service prohibits the mailing of perfume, but she later learns he'd falsified his address. After he fails to materialize, they exchange some fevered emails, and that's where I'm cutting in. He said he was at fault for not communicating the extremity of his paranoia. That's why he'd lied about the address. He said that was really a lie, not a fiction. If everything else were a fiction, this would be too, but I just lied about that because I was afraid. But he said that in a way, he now understood that he had kind of turned us both into characters. He said he did very stupid things when he felt under pressure, and he was ashamed to say he'd lied about the address. He thought he'd meet me that first night in the restaurant and explain. He'd really made that reservation. Then everything fell apart. I said, "I'm sorry I keep asking questions. I should probably just say I'm sorry too, and I should have listened when you said you were paranoid and not made such a long trip because I should have known better. But I still want to ask you things, just so I can understand." The narrator then asks for affirmation or a denial of some specific things he told her and continues, "I guess I couldn't really judge you badly for making things up if you did, because I'm the one who said that we all do that in love. Imagine ourselves and the other person to be characters in a way. So it's really very silly of me to ask you for the truth. Although everything I told you was true, there's nothing I wrote or said to you or sent you that I'm ashamed of, and there's nothing I'd mind if someone else saw. When I was most naked, I was most clothed." I apologize for the melodrama. I was kind of in shock. I had to finish that message so I could go shower and go to the airport. I ended it, "Maybe we should write, but less. What do you think? Or should I write you when I finish the dances in the book? I'm not sure. I'm confused. Well, it was still such a beautiful year. I think I still love you for that." I took the S-Bahn to the airport. It was smooth and efficient like everything else in Cologne. But when I got to the security checkpoint, I saw a sign showing what things were prohibited, like we have in the United States, and like that sign at the post office that I disregarded when it prohibited my perfume. And there on the sign was a picture of a bottle with a skull and crossbones on it, and next to it was the German word, gift. My mouth dropped open, because I knew that, but I'd forgotten it. In German, gift is poison. The title of the novel I wanted to write, the novel about Sami and Tai and Eros and the economy and collaboration, that book was, in my mind, called The Gift, after Marcel Mauss and Louis Hyde's reading of Mauss and David Graeber's and mine. It was meant to be funny, the title, because it's been re-gifted so many times. Seriously, type in The Gift on the Amazon Books page. You won't believe how many people have used that title. And it had all started as a kind of a joke, an experiment to see if I could produce a ridiculous surplus of unoriginal gifts of purely sentimental value. Then Sami and I had spent nearly a year giving each other gifts, excessive ones, beautiful ones, and I'd been thinking about his gift, his Insabagabo savant syndrome, which is wonderful but also a terrible burden. And it was so devastating to think that my gifts, maybe even the beautiful ones, maybe even this novel, might also be poisonous for him. And maybe his gift was also poisonous for me. I thought that maybe the hazardous thing was the realism. I could understand that. Maybe the whole thing needed to remain in the realm of the imaginary. They tried to tell me that at the US Post Office. Now the Germans were trying to tell me the dangerous thing was the gift itself. I was almost sick in the airport, but I managed to get on my plane and get home.
Anger, on Audre Lorde's analysis, does not cause distortion. It is in some sense activated by the distortions of structural oppression, why violence is enacted, remembered, threatened, and/or anticipated. Anger haunts, is haunted. It may arise in this particular moment between you and me, but it invokes a larger history that precedes and exceeds this time and this particular us. This is a very different diagnosis of the relation between facts and feelings from the one put forward by those who wring their hands at the unruly entry of emotions into US politics. The latter view holds out hope for the return to balance, to a Goldilocks of perfect moderation, not too much feeling, not too little, as it is embodied in an American political center. This Goldilocks is also Aristotle's golden mean. Where there's anger, such anger should be righteous indignation, directed at the correct bad objects and expressed in the right way. But whose bad objects? Whose right of way? African Americans and other minoritized groups have long been denied the right to be justifiably angry. Instead, their anger is seen as scary, excessive, un-American. As Tab Nyong'o underlines in an essay provocatively entitled Civility Disobedience, the good star of civility is offered, always provisionally, to the charmed few. Civility is an asymmetrical imperative, as we've seen in the condemnation of Black Lives Matter for its alleged anti-white racism, and the quick conversion of quarterback Colin Kaepernick's carefully choreographed silent protest of US racism into an unpatriotic assault on American values. Implicit and explicit calls to move on, get over, and leave behind not just negative feelings of anger or outrage, but also forms of grief that disturb dominant conventions of mourning are ghosted by this violent history too. Some bodies are always already seen as protesting too much, even when they are on bended knee. What will happen to all that beauty? Those who occupy the center of American life are far more likely to have their feelings, including their negative feelings of anger, disappointment, frustration, grief, ratified as facts, literally legitimated through laws and policies, and supported in extra-legal realms that justify and strive to repair the hurt feelings of some individuals and groups more than others. The calls for civility and consensus can thus mystify power relations and perpetuate social inequalities. Not only that, the romance of civility cleans up what it actually feels like to share space with others one knows and likes, let alone what it feels like to encounter those whom one does not yet know, may fear, and may or may not even like after getting to know them. Calls for civility are frequently yoked to the notion that in political life and in other spheres of human relating to, no one's feelings should ever be hurt. This is certainly a fantasy where the schoolyard and family dinner table are concerned. As a fantasy about the conduct of political life, and especially as a fantasy about how we disagree with each other over morally charged issues, and what such disagreements feel like, the dream of consensus above all may actually block possibilities for vibrant and truly inclusive democratic life. This doesn't mean democracy is going to feel good. In fact, it quite often means it will not. Feelings don't occur in a vacuum. They have a political and social history as well as a psychic life. Feelings are raced, they also racialize. The dilemma is not solved, however, by bringing more subjects into the sphere of dispassionate secular reason. This is because reasonableness itself is raced. As Jose Munoz argues, the paradigms of communicative reason that structure the majoritarian public sphere correlate affective and racial normativities. It is not simply that the feelings of the dominant come to matter more. The deeper issue here is that some feelings predominate as the measure of proper democratic belonging and participation in shared public life. What might democratic engagement with difference look like and feel like in practice? And how might it require giving up, mourning even, the twin fantasy of a world without conflict and of grief freed of all anger? To return to an earlier point, democracy in these agonistic terms probably would not feel so good, and most certainly not for the culturally dominant, who might have to give something up. However, social relations on scales large and small are not only about beautiful feelings and everything going your way. My apologies to Oscar Hammerstein. This is among the reasons we need courts to protect the rights of unpopular minorities from the sentiments of majority rules. Moreover, what if, as Audre Lorde suggests, risking discomfort and yes, discomforting anger were actually of value for democratic life and possibilities of social justice, not to mention a necessity for the art of being mortal in a world shared with other beings, human and non. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time.
Okay, this next piece I'm going to read picks up some of the themes from what I just read before. It is from my novel in progress that I'm just finishing up, and the novel takes place in maybe it's just a paranoid future projection of mine, but a near future world in which, who knows, maybe women's reproductive capacities will be more closely surveilled than they are today. Just a thought. And all you need to know for this passage is, first of all, that young women of reproductive age can elect to wear Fitbit-like devices called health tracks that are tracking their reproductive readiness. And Also, that the protagonist's name is Sarah and her husband's name is David, and he has given her one of these little health tracks on a very pretty little silver chain. Okay, and so this scene just opens with Sarah at the doctor's office waiting for the nurse to come in and see her. Okay, so the nurse shows up. The health technician came in and sat across from her. "How are you feeling today, Sarah?" "I'm okay." Sarah drew the paper gown closer around her body, trying to ignore the harsh, crinkling sound it made. "I'm not really sure why I'm here, actually." "Well, we're a little concerned that you're not hitting all the marks on your maternal wellness chart." The technician turned the screen toward Sarah. "Here, take a look." Sarah leaned forward and peered at the screen. "I'm not really sure how to read this." But basically what we're seeing here are some troubling gaps between the health track's messaging function and your response time, the technician said, pointing to the screen. "For instance, on this day, we see a lapse of over an hour and a half between the time you become clinically dehydrated and when you actually get something to drink." Sarah turned away and stared out the window, trying to focus her attention on the soft play of clouds against the sky. The health technician was still speaking, "And here we see it signaling that it's time for you to go to bed around 10 p.m., and here's where you actually start to fall asleep around 4 in the morning." Sarah looked more closely at the date and time on the graph. It was the night of her mother's visit. "I just couldn't seem to sleep that night," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "I had a lot on my mind." "Things like this concern us, Sarah. Each individual wellness infraction may not seem like much, but when you add them up, they can have a negative effect on your overall maternal health profile." The health technician smiled gently. Her teeth, Sarah noticed, were extremely even and white. A pretty mouth. Sarah wished her head didn't hurt so much. I guess I'm just feeling a little nervous about everything." The health tech nodded sympathetically. "I'll tell you what. I'm going to put you on our special first trimester watch list. It means we'll be keeping an extra close eye on your outcomes, so you don't have to worry so much. And I'm going to ask you to attend daily relaxation and meditation sessions as part of your self-care rubric. Just be sure to scan your health track each time so you get credit. Sound good?" Sarah felt as if her insides were burning up. A wave of nausea racked her body. She ran to the sink and threw up. "Oh, sorry," Sarah said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The health technician frowned and handed her a paper towel. She buzzed for someone from sanitary services to clean up the mess. That evening, the night revealed itself to be sticky and damp. A pungent, sickly smell of wilted flowers floated through the open window. Sarah pulled the shades and stripped off her clothes and stood naked before the mirror, slathering her skin with body balm. The health technician had told her to keep better track of her overall hydration levels. She kept forgetting to drink enough water, and to be sure to keep her skin moisturized. She looked at the framed picture of David and frowned. The photo, she realized, somehow had the effect of those old masters' paintings. The eyes seemed to follow her everywhere. She turned the picture so he faced the wall. It was crazy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the health track was judging her, that it knew what she was thinking. She fingered the pretty silver band. It was an inanimate object, an unthinking piece of technology. In terms of design, it was barely more sophisticated than the drugstore pedometer she bought in high school. And yet, did she detect a flash of knowledge in its gaze? No, that was crazy. She remembered the ugly mood ring David had once given her as a joke. "So I can tell when you have PMS," he said, winking. She hadn't thought it was funny at all, but he'd given it to her as an apology for a fight, and she knew she'd look like even more of a bitch if she said anything. She wore it for a little while, and was surprised that the cheap toy really did seem to register her emotions, giving off a deep blue color when she felt good, and a disturbing muddy brown orange when she was agitated. The health track was nothing more than that, she told herself. An expensive tech toy, an adult's plaything. It glowed those colors for the same reason a mood ring did. It sensed the heat given off by your skin, and that caused the colors to change. That was all. And yet, how did it know she was scared? How could it tell she was angry? And what was she supposed to do about the fact that all of her emotional and physical information was being forwarded to the doctors and staff? "Stop it," she yelled at the health track, hitting it over and over. She winced in pain. She had punched herself hard.
Non-fiction, maybe. Janis Joplin in 1970. Freedom's just another word for nothing less left to lose, she sang just before she died, giving voice to a revolutionary anthem. How did we fare, those of us who grew up in ill-fitting surrounds like hand-me-down suits, jacket sleeves a bit long, pants at the high tide mark, fabric scratchy and easily torn by the slightest insult? How did we manage our way through the separation demanded by body and environment to be able to play and think creatively as we came into adulthood, not just alone, but also with others? Were our chests hollowed out instead of proudly forward, our shoulders caved in a little, our hearts shrouded? Was our skin papery thin? Like fledglings that leave the nest before they can fly, I hastily gathered up parental cast-offs, bits of hubris, narcissistic love, and paranoid self-protection, and patched them together into a mismatched outfit to drape over a fragile self. And I flew off. My mother had a mothering mantra: leave home as soon as you can, get a good education, leave the country, don't marry, don't have children, don't get trapped like me, she said. She too flew the coop in her teens, and under the topsy-turvy mantle of World War II, found a way to be her anxious but efficient and stylish self, running railway tea rooms on the other side of the country, making do with chipped cups and saucers and thin pale tea and sandwiches from stretched-out rations. These years, she recalled, were the best of her life. Then the men came home. My father-to-be came home from 5 years on the front lines, broken but silent about it, as men were in those days, except for pub night, which was every night, when those who'd gone overseas drank heavily and goaded the men who didn't go to war, but who also drank, goaded them into fighting and coming home late to wife and kids, thinking they were still in army fatigues, fighting a war they'd won on the battlefields, but not in their hearts. Those were the best years of my life, my father said, of his time in the European theater. You're my soldier, he also said, casting a proud gaze in my direction when I got into fights with classmates, the weaker ones, the ones who didn't or couldn't fight back. Thus I pushed off into the world. Narcissistic love, while not the greatest, was better than no love, and it carried me through. Paranoid defenses were better than no protection, and saved me many a time. Love came late in life, and I mean this less in the form of a person and people, although I was lucky there too, but more a greater capacity to love, to see beyond self and to recognize others, especially the suffering of others, as distinct from mine. Do I recognize the necessity of dependence, Winnicott's stage of extreme sophistication, not always reached by adults? Only time will tell. But a far, far bigger question is, what if our nation recognized its dependence on other nations? What if our nation and other nations recognized that we were dependent on each other? Now, perhaps more than any other time in recent history, this acknowledgement is critical to survival, not just for one, but for all.
The last passage I'm going to read is from a work that's coming out soon. It's called Who the Hell is Imre Lodbrok? It's a co-authored semi-fictional text that recounts another collaborative project that was initiated on the internet, eventually shifting to IRL antics, narrated with a somewhat exaggerated sense of danger that yet again appears to be inflected by our cultural anxieties regarding social media, particularly in the age of alternative facts on the internet. This chapter that I'm reading from is called Virus, and it begins with an anecdote about a piece of spam I received, ostensibly from an Eastern European girl named Olga, who proposed that I might make a nice boyfriend for her. She suggested we swap dirty pictures and included a hyperlink to her profile. I jokingly sent it to my partner, Imre, who opened the link out of curiosity and got a nasty computer virus. I go on to describe some other suspicious emails I sometimes receive, some claiming to be from international dance scholars and students asking my professional advice. There was, for example, Masahoud Sharif. I reproduce in the text his first inquiry, in which he says he's a 32-year-old Mauritanian living in Belgium for political reasons. Though the son of a very rich man, he says he's working in a specialized video store, and in fact is himself starring in some specialized videos, but that his true passion is, quote, the dances related to sexual and ritual practices in different civilizations. He asks for some bibliographic leads on this. I send him a brief syllabus and wish him well in his research, but he doggedly pursues further communication, saying, my girlfriend works in the same profession as me, and she told me to forget the erotic dance to develop my other skills. He tries to enlist me in giving him private lessons on the internet, adding he'll understand if I prefer not to show my face. Now I'm reading from the text. I really didn't want to encourage Masaoud, so I thought I'd try sending a final message that was professional, curt, and conclusive. Sorry, I can only advise you on the academic end of things. Best of luck, B. But it seems he was not so easy to deter. He answered, Dear Madam Browning. This also really happened. Dear Madam Browning, I like very much an academic. I expect this very much from you because you are the good person to teach me what I want to learn and get passionate with my skills. In the book, I go on to say that this may strike a person as a sort of comical conundrum, but in fact it freaked me out a little because it fell on the heels of a very disturbing episode involving distrust in digital correspondence, the one I just told you about. The chapter ends with a couple of other anecdotes concerning Imre's own experiences with shady virtual figures. In order to clarify the end of this story, I should tell you that in his youth, he had a platonic but intense relationship with a talented young pianist who tragically took her own life. But back to the narrative of his more recent virtual encounters. The most heartbreaking story involved a young singer-songwriter in Scandinavia, a woman with a wistful voice and a simple but lovely guitar technique. I'll call her Nix. He alerted me to her, thinking I might share his regard for her body of work, and I did. Her songs were all quite similar, as Imre put it, seemingly one long, quiet, plaintive cry. Why were they so affecting? Aside from the native loveliness of her voice, I can only explain the appeal through their unmistakable sincerity. She had almost no followers at all. Imre felt compelled to encourage her, and soon she left him a couple of messages of gratitude, which quickly became a little frightening, as she communicated in them some of the same despair and hopelessness that ran through her songs. When she appeared to desire from Imre encouragement that went beyond the question of music, he worried she might be expecting more engagement than he felt he could offer, and he pulled back. Maybe she looked for this support from other strangers, or maybe from her friends, and maybe, for some reason or another, it was never enough. But after a time, she stopped posting music. After Nix disappeared, Imre worried about her. Despite his usual disinclination to Google anything, he did a bit of his own internet sleuthing and discovered the sad truth. If you think the trail of online postings and a Facebook page with her same avatar might be an indication of a reliable, true story. Nix had posted a number of seemingly delusional comments indicating that a Danish pop star had stolen one of her songs, and then that her family was trying to make her take antipsychotic medications, and then that she was being locked up. And finally it appeared, from the mix of heartbroken and angry comments of others, that she had taken her own life. I thought of Nix when Imre later told me the story of the delicate young pianist he'd met at the École Normale de Musique. Or maybe I thought of the pianist when we pieced together the story of Nix. Right now, I can't remember which came first. Both stories are so sad.
Thank you all. The format is a bit of a high wire act. And it's astonishing to watch you all each in your own ways. And I notice I want to borrow Carolyn's phrase, both nonfiction, maybe, and fiction, maybe. So the idea for this panel was born after the long slog, or actually in the midst of the long slog of the 2016 American presidential election. But in fact, these categories reverberate differently, at least for me, today. And as a case in point, I found myself reading the Eric Santner book about the Schreiber case. And there's a line about how anytime you see a culture of paranoia, a fascism of one kind or another can't be far behind. So with that in mind, I wonder if we could just kick off the discussion that we'll have for the next 20 minutes or so by asking you to just go down the line and talk a little bit about how you came to present just this, and not something else that you might have presented, say, a year ago.
I go first each time. I feel like I should be able to pass the mic. I was teaching Baldwin in the spring, and I was teaching Baldwin in a class, it's an undergraduate class, I think I've taught 7 times now, Religion, Sexuality, in U.S. Public Life, and I added the term affect to the title. I was always talking about the politics of affect and the history of affect, but I added it to the title because I really wanted to foreground for the students and for myself how to think through the super feeling, but not to just count feelings as insubstantial. I wanted to think about what feelings do. And I added Baldwin to the syllabus because I needed to read Baldwin myself at that moment. And I was very struck by the passage that I read to you today about paranoia and the way that how to think about the fact that paranoia is a form of knowledge. Now, paranoia at its root etymologically means actually beyond knowledge, what we could actually know. You kind of go out of your mind. But when we accuse people, what if we're accusing people of paranoia who have a deep knowledge that we ourselves disavow? So I'm actually trying to think about the trickiness of paranoia. I mean, Baldwin's basically saying that the suspicion with which African Americans regard white Americans, this country, is justified by history. But it can become a paranoia, so more than history, that then gets in the way of the development of other kinds of potentially sustaining relations. Now, in saying this, he's not letting white people off the hook or white racism off the hook. He's trying to talk about the dilemma of developing different kinds of relations given this history. So so I've just been really trying to think in the thicket of a paranoia that is actually a form of knowledge, that it is maybe a kind of subjugated knowledge, and that then to diagnose it as paranoia is in some sense to depoliticize and will away the truth that might be spoken through it.
In terms of these 3 pieces, I mean, I would say that for the first piece, I've always been interested in the historical situatedness of my mother's specific paranoia and how much it seemed to be just born out of this just say no culture of the 1980s, that was the cultural script that she borrowed from. And so, part of me wonders, how people today might be drawing from the scripts of the Trump administration, right? And I'm certain there are all sorts of ways in which that's happening. People in this room would probably know better than I. But in terms of the other 2 pieces, one thing that's become very clear to me as a fiction writer is that I and other writers I know are scrambling to keep up with the dystopic pace of our current political situation. And so, down to things like plot points that one would not think about revising otherwise. And one thing that I realized in the process of writing this reproductive rights dystopia is that I've had to kind of ratchet things up in ways that I had not expected. Part of my plot hinges very much on the idea that my protagonist is on birth control pills, and I just sort of, in writing the draft, took for granted that birth control pills would actually still be accessible in this near future world, and now that is, potentially looking, who knows, less and less likely. And so just thinking about how creative people might be responding, with some sort of foreshadowing of future events in the moment. Let's just say that plot developments that in the past I might have thought would be sort of paranoid as part of my imagination now seem more and more realistic.
So that's an interesting question to ask, Lauren. And I think that, as you said, when we first conceived of this panel, it was very much in the wake of the presidential election. And I think at the time, I was thinking very much psychoanalytically about Trump and about the GOP and about mental illness, et cetera, but as time has gone by, I found that those kinds of categories are really not at all useful. And so I began to spin out more into fiction. And so I had an assembly of fact and fiction or whatever, that felt like it came a little closer to something I was trying to get at rather than some kind of return to what was happening politically.
When the whole alternative facts thing hit, I really was thrown for a loop because I've been arguing for alternative facts for a long time. I think they're great, and then suddenly, but yeah, dystopia, and we all know that in the dystopian fiction is selling like hotcakes now, and everybody's turning to it. And so I've been trying to think a lot about why, what we think we're doing when we're reading it, and what it's doing for us, and also what we think we're doing when we're writing it. One of the things so a couple of things, as I was hearing, I loved listening to you guys, but there were a bunch of like things that went bing bing for me, as points of connection that I hadn't really anticipated. Laura and I share and not just the fact that we write fiction, but also a family history of psychopathology. So in my case, my father also was severely bipolar, and it wasn't until I put these little sections together that I realized, I thought I was going to read to you things about paranoid narrators, and then I realized that almost every passage that I was choosing also involved the narrator who had cathected to another paranoid person, and which is, and I'm sure that has something to do with that family history. But another thing that when Anne was presenting, because I was thinking, so the narrator of the very first novel that I read from is of mixed race, which is part of the reason, that's related to the question of what he's sort of trying to work out in response to what's happening, after Obama's election. But and as I said, that it's a truism. Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean I'm wrong. So my paranoid. So the narrator is paranoid, but obviously right about a lot of things. But that when I was hearing you and make the choice to read, particularly in the second passage, to basically just to read Baldwin, to give voice to, and so it was a weird, difficult decision for me to think of what it would mean for me to take the voice of a narrator of color, to take on that narrative voice and to be that voice. And I thought a lot about it, and I, still kind of wonder about that. But it also weirdly has a little bit to do with this family history, because one of my father's, when he would kind of flip out, one of the things that would happen would be that he would have cross-racial identification moments. He would be confused about his own race, which is interesting to me. And once again, it's one of those things where you can say, just because I'm in a state of psychosis doesn't mean I haven't figured something pretty interesting out. So, I'll leave it at that.
Well, now we have time for your questions, but we don't have a second mic, so you have to really shout. Oh, we do, thank you. We do have a second mic, you don't have to yell.
You can yell, however. Let's not be normative.
Hey, that was great. Really great. So I guess I'm thinking about a couple of things. One, some keywords that were popping up both explicitly and implicitly. So disavowal and distortion. Again, when you talk about distortion, I was thinking, like, where does distortion come from? And it's related to torture, right? Turning. And that act of disavowal as a state of paranoia too. Me, not me. Free, not free. I know, I don't know. And so I'm trying to think about the way, and so this also redounds to what you're talking about with civility. And, just like the ways in which civility distorts us, tortures us into a state that we have to disavow. And so, I'm just trying to think about that in terms of bodily terms, in terms of self-understanding. The second thing I was thinking about was not about the dystopic, but about the utopic. Where utopia is no place, no time. Right? Because what you were all describing with the dystopic is like a specific conception of place and time. Right? We're driven by November 9th into midnight to November 10th. into another time. And so, what happens if the paranoid turns to the utopic and not to the dystopic, or no place, no time? Or something like that.
Not everyone will.
Right, I mean, that's a more hopeful gesture, I think, maybe. I mean, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, I think. And I think often, if we're thinking politically, moments that seem to be ideal for certain groups are obviously not ideal for others. And when I think about the trend of dystopic writing and what people are kind of, what's becoming so attractive about it for so many people is trying to understand how there can be such a division right now in the United States and elsewhere between people who seem to have these completely polar oppositional reads or interpretations on what's going on. So presumably for about half the population, sometimes we're told 35%, whatever, but about half the population seems to think everything is great, and the other half seems to think it's not great, or people think it's not great or dystopic in different ways. And it's as if like we have two parallel dystopias going on at the same time that people are living in. And so I think of the resurgence in dystopic fiction or gestures as being some way of trying to work within these different realities that people feel they're living in. Where there seems to be this disavowal, not just of others' realities, but the sense that one's own reality is being disavowed in so many profound ways.
The only thing I would add, sorry, this is a very provocative question, so I'm going to I feel like we're all sort of sitting with it. But I'm actually thinking back to Ken Corbett's beautiful talk yesterday and the way in which he kind of revived a Winnicott for us. And I'm sort of thinking about the question of play, or what play can do. And this might be about the role that fiction might play at this moment that seems, well, more horrible than the fiction many of us could dream. That we need spaces in which to dream and imagine a different reality to come. So that at a moment when actually the external reality is, the scale of the problems facing us, not just nationally but globally, is so vast that how do we develop the resources to reckon with that? And Ken, sort of going to Winnicott, was talking about the resting places within which we can develop different ways to move and think. And so creative work, fiction among them, might be a space within which we can start to imagine, actually contrary to fact, which is, and so as to create new facts, not alternative facts, but new facts, different kinds of living spaces for a different kind of future. So it's to put imagination and reality back together in a new form, but one that does not deny reality.
I should just say that my preference would be for the utopian energies rather than utopias. Right?
Yes.
So that kind of helps us into imagining something.
And we're never going to get there.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
dealing with the failure of never arriving
Exactly.
is itself the energy to animate us forward.
Should I ask my question? First of all, I loved all of your presentations so much. I have a clinical question, which is related to the Baldwin quote, which is about the place of righteousness, I guess. I've been thinking with some patients of mine recently about when someone's been exploited in various ways, there's a tension between, on the one hand, getting inside the mind of the perpetrator, because of course it's also in the patient's mind as well, right? If there's an identification as well. And with saying no and sort of righteously claiming no to something to an act that was evil, right? Evil in the sense of being an exploitation of a human. And I guess I just see this as a tension that I haven't sorted through, and I'm wondering clinically if people have thoughts about that dilemma of sort of the place of a righteous refusal, I guess.
That's a great question. It's an interesting and complicated question. I think that for most people who have suffered from trauma, that there's a need to kind of first get to the no and get to the refusal and find a place to stand there before one can get to the place of empathy for the other, or the place of appreciating the other, or being inside the space of the other. It's a huge task for therapists to even consider that possibility, so I appreciate your question.
I just had a follow-up thought about what Anne was saying about fiction, which you put into words something I couldn't quite formulate. But what I don't exactly think it was formulating, but what I was sitting here trying to sort through was how much pleasure I took in what you guys were up to. And how it was funny. A lot of times it was just straight up funny. How much I was enjoying it, and I guess I wonder if there may not be not only a need for fiction, but a need for comedy. And is there, I don't know enough about dystopian fiction to know about the role of comedy in dystopian fiction. They don't seem exactly to go, maybe there are paradigms that make a certain kind of sense. In the spirit of play, I do think there is something in play that is comedic. There may be something about the resting place that comedy provides that is important in this moment. And I don't know, maybe it has something to...
Well, just certainly, this is obviously not a new thought, but just the ways in which comedy and comedians and stand-up shows, the comedians have become the spokespeople for us and for our times, and crossing between comedy and seriousness and creating a kind of third space there that we haven't had before, which I think is quite wonderful. I don't want to thank anybody for that, but...
Yes, absolutely, and I think there's a big need for comedy and for play. But one thing also that I was noting, and I was really happy that Winnicott kept coming up, but when Laura was talking about, the little, they're toys, right? So they're toys, and now of course our cell phones are everybody's main transitional object, and it's like we can't get away from it. So, but it's a little scary because also Trump is really funny. I mean, it's funny but scary. It's scary but funny, and you can't believe that that's not supposed to be funny. That's not. It's like really, but the very notion that what he's doing is tweeting, the very Twitter, all of this at Facebook, where these names came from. They're like children's play. It's all to tweet is now something that, it's like Tweety Bird or something. It's so weird. But this comical childlike thing has become this monster. So yes, on the one hand, yes, the comedy is super necessary, and yet it's really also freaky. But dystopian fiction, like Dr. Strangelove, is hilarious and also mortifying, and that's kind of where we are.
One more thing about comedy, which is Chekhov. And when I think comedy, I think Chekhov. So Chekhov actually understood himself as doing comic plays. And he actually said about his understanding of comedy and his plays as comedy, that he is trying to show to his audience a set of conditions that didn't have to be chosen. So it's comedy insofar as We're being shown a world that could become otherwise if we were to act and choose differently. So I think that's a really different conception of the comic, as allowing for the possibility for change and transformation, which is, we might laugh, but laughter can hurt.
One more question.
Well, it's a comment, not a question. Thank you. This was great, and it was so creative, and I don't need that. I'm going to shout. I'm going to perform. So I very much appreciated this format, and I just want to say about comedy that I started to laugh, and then I felt nauseous. Particularly when you were reading about the health bit, whatever it was, I started to feel nauseous because I feel like it just borders on the truth. And I feel like we are all living in this state of kind of paranoia at this point, and so when you were saying that, it's going to be, I feel like it made me realize like that is what we're all going to be sort of negotiating now, going forward, that something is funny and it isn't funny. Wow, thank you, but it's breaking my heart.
There's another one.
I actually wonder if we're not being paranoid enough. And I wonder if there are ways in which we're deploying this discourse of paranoia as a way of defending against. There are tragic things happening, and there's not enough mobilization around what is happening. And I wonder if it's going more to if the affective component of that is getting too easily rerouted or too defensively rerouted into thinking, because we're not out in the streets. And so I wonder about the work that thinking about paranoia is doing, rather than being more paranoid and giving more weight to the paranoia.
Well, that's just ended your
I think that's a really provocative question, and I'm just wondering about the relationship between, like, a certain kind of pacified paranoia or paranoia turned into thinking about paranoia and relationship and political passivity. And there is something astonishing. I'm sure that many people in this room took part in the Women's March in various places in this country, and the numbers of bodies on the streets across this country that day were staggering. And there have been many, many thousands in the streets in the weeks subsequent to that. The moment Trump, yes, the first Muslim ban. I mean, there was instant organizing that happened to people in the streets, and there was a series of protests that happened very quickly around the horrific anti-immigration and anti-Muslim bans that Trump was trying to put through. And I think people got exhausted, right? So that's part of it. But there is something, why don't we have sustained movement in the streets in this country? What is it? And I'm an historian, so look, people in the room who think more historically than I or deeper training than I, but why is there the turn back into the House, or this fantasy that the Constitution will save us? Right? And because there is something about that. Well, we don't have to be too paranoid. We've got a document which will out. Why do we think that? Since this document also has the Electoral College, which gave us this.
And we were talking about this a little bit last night, that one thing that was striking, at least to me, about the Women's March or the Women's Marches was that there was something about it. There was certainly anger there and paranoia, but there was also a lot of playfulness and humor and irony and pussy hats and, people with like fabulous, posters, like, I can't believe I have to protest this shit again, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a good thing, and it can be a dangerous thing. It can also be a passive thing, because it's harder to feel fabulous when you are out at a protest about an anti-Muslim ban. It's just, it's harder to be fabulous and sexy at those protests. And so thinking about what kinds of protests are accessible and available to people in this particular cultural moment, how we've learned to think about our late night comics as providing the kind of commentary that is most available to us now when we talk about politics. It seems important to think about and where we might want to be more sincere and more angry, to go back to Anne's point.
So I'm afraid we are out of time. And so I would like to sincerely thank you.